I arrived excited for my son's wedding, certain that I would be present at one of the most important moments of his life. To my surprise, the priest looked at me strangely and said that the ceremony had already taken place the day before. They had moved the wedding earlier, and no one had even bothered to let me know. Margaret Chen had always believed that the bond between a mother and son was unbreakable. For 28 years, she and her son David had been each other's anchor through life's storms. When her husband Michael died in a car accident 12 years ago, it was David who held her hand at the funeral, David who helped her navigate the insurance paperwork, David who called every Sunday without fail to check on her well-being. Their small ranch house in suburban Denver had become a sanctuary of shared memories. The walls were lined with photographs chronicling David's journey from gap-toothed little league player to accomplished software engineer. Margaret had sacrificed so much to give him the best education possible, working double shifts as a nurse at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, taking on extra weekend shifts in the emergency room when money was tight. Every dollar she earned seemed to flow naturally toward David's needs: his college tuition at Colorado State, his first apartment deposit, help with his student loans when he was starting his career. "Mom, you don't have to do this," David would protest whenever she slipped him another check or insisted on paying for his groceries during their weekly shopping trips together. "Nonsense," Margaret would reply, waving away his concerns with flour-dusted hands as she pulled his favorite chocolate chip cookies from the oven. "What else am I going to spend my money on? You're my investment in the future." And what a good investment he had proven to be. David was kind, thoughtful, successful in his work, and until 2 years ago, completely devoted to their small family unit of 2. They had dinner together every Tuesday, attended the same Methodist church on Sundays, and spent holidays cooking elaborate meals that were far too large for just the 2 of them, but perfect for creating the kind of abundance Margaret had dreamed of during her own sparse childhood. Everything began to change when David met Vanessa Morrison at a tech conference in Austin. Margaret remembered the first time David mentioned her. His eyes had lit up in a way she'd never seen before, and his voice carried a breathless excitement that made Margaret's heart skip with both joy and an inexplicable sense of foreboding. "She's incredible, Mom," David had gushed over their usual Tuesday dinner. "She's brilliant, works in digital marketing for this huge firm. And she's so sophisticated, you know? She's traveled all over Europe, speaks 3 languages, knows about wine and art and all these things I've never even thought about." Margaret had smiled and asked all the right questions. But something in Vanessa's description had set off tiny alarm bells in her maternal intuition. She'd met plenty of David's girlfriends over the years, sweet college girls, fellow engineers, a teacher he'd dated for 8 months, and she'd always been able to connect with them, to find common ground in their shared affection for her son. But Vanessa sounded different, polished, intimidating, like someone from a completely different world than their comfortable, unpretentious life in suburban Denver. The first meeting confirmed Margaret's worst fears. Vanessa arrived at the house wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly mortgage payment, carrying a purse that Margaret recognized from magazine ads but had never seen in person. She was undeniably beautiful, tall and willowy with perfect blonde hair styled in waves that looked effortlessly elegant but had probably taken hours to achieve. Her smile was camera-ready, her handshake firm and confident, her voice carrying just the slightest hint of what sounded like a practiced upper-class accent. "Mrs. Chen, David has told me so much about you," Vanessa had said, surveying the living room with its comfortable but dated furniture and family photographs. "What a charming home you have. So authentic." The word authentic had hung in the air like a subtle insult disguised as a compliment. Margaret had caught the brief flicker of something. Disdain? Calculation? That crossed Vanessa's perfect features before the brilliant smile returned. Over the following months, Margaret watched as subtle changes began to appear in her relationship with David. Their Tuesday dinners became increasingly infrequent as David cited work obligations or plans with Vanessa. Their Sunday church attendance shifted to every other week, then monthly as David explained, that he and Vanessa were exploring different spiritual paths together. The weekly grocery shopping trips, stopped entirely when David mentioned that Vanessa preferred shopping at Whole Foods and had introduced him to a completely different approach to nutrition. Each change was small, reasonable, easily explained, but together they created a growing distance that Margaret felt but couldn't quite articulate without sounding possessive or jealous. She tried to include Vanessa in their family traditions, inviting her to holiday dinners, suggesting the three of them take a weekend trip to visit David's favorite childhood spots in the mountains. But Vanessa always had other commitments, other plans, other people to see. She has such a busy social calendar, David would explain apologetically. Her friend circle is really important to her career, you know? Networking and all that. Margaret noticed that David had started using phrases that sounded foreign coming from his mouth. Networking, personal brand, strategic relationships. He dressed differently too, replacing his comfortable jeans and flannel shirts with business casual attire even on weekends. His hair was styled now instead of simply combed, and he'd started wearing cologne that smelled expensive and unfamiliar. The changes weren't necessarily bad, Margaret told herself. David was growing, expanding his horizons, becoming more sophisticated. Wasn't that what every mother wanted for her child? But she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't becoming more himself. He was becoming someone else entirely. Someone who fit better into Vanessa's world than into the life they had built together. The engagement announcement came via text message on a Thursday afternoon in March. Margaret was restocking supplies in the hospital pharmacy when her phone buzzed. "Great news, Mom." Vanessa said yes. "We're getting married in June. Can't wait to tell you all about our plans. Love you." Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, tears blurring her vision. Not because she wasn't happy for David, she was, truly, but because she learned about one of the most important moments in her son's life through a text message. In the old days, David would have called her immediately, probably from the restaurant where he'd proposed, breathless with excitement and wanting to share every detail. He would have brought Vanessa over that evening so they could all celebrate together with champagne and tears and the kind of overwhelming joy that Margaret had imagined would mark this milestone. Instead, she got a text message, and when she called David back 20 minutes later, it went straight to voicemail. He called her back 3 days later, full of apologies about being absolutely swamped with work and wedding planning. They made plans for Margaret to meet them for brunch on Sunday to hear all about the engagement and start discussing wedding plans. Margaret spent the entire week before the meeting alternately excited and anxious, shopping for a new outfit, getting her hair done, and trying to prepare herself to be the kind of mother-in-law that a sophisticated woman like Vanessa would appreciate. The brunch meeting took place at an upscale restaurant in downtown Denver that Margaret had never been to before. The menu was full of items she didn't recognize at prices that made her wince. Vanessa and David were already seated when she arrived, heads bent together over what looked like wedding magazines and planning notebooks. They looked up when she approached, and Margaret was struck by how perfectly they matched. Both impeccably dressed, both radiating the kind of polished confidence that came from success and social ease. "Mom!" David stood to hug her, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. But as soon as they sat down, Margaret sensed an invisible wall between herself and the couple across from her. They spoke in a kind of shorthand about venues and caterers and photographers, referencing people and places Margaret had never heard of. When she tried to contribute, suggesting the church where she and Michael had been married, or offering to help with flowers from her own garden, her ideas were politely dismissed as not quite what we're looking for, or not really our style. "We're thinking of something more contemporary," Vanessa explained with that same brilliant smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Something that reflects who we are as a couple, you know? David has such refined taste now. I've really helped him discover his aesthetic." The words stung more than Margaret could have anticipated. David had always had taste, she wanted to protest. Maybe it wasn't sophisticated or expensive, but it was his own. Now, apparently, his taste was something that needed to be discovered and refined by someone else. "What about the guest list?" Margaret asked, trying to find some area where she could contribute. "I'd love to help you think through family and friends who should be there." David and Vanessa exchanged a look that Margaret couldn't quite interpret. "Actually, Mom, we're planning a pretty intimate ceremony," David said. Just immediate family and very close friends. We want it to feel really personal and meaningful. Of course, Margaret agreed, feeling a flutter of warmth. Immediate family, that meant her, certainly. Perhaps some of David's cousins, her sister Patricia from California, a few of the church friends who had watched David grow up. I'd be happy to help you work through the logistics. When were you thinking? June can be tricky for booking venues. June 15th, Vanessa said firmly. We've already booked everything. The venue, the caterer, the photographer, the flowers, everything's taken care of. Margaret blinked in surprise. Oh, that's efficient. Would you like me to handle the invitations? I know you're both so busy with work. Actually, we've got that covered too, Vanessa replied smoothly. We're doing everything online these days. Digital invitations, digital RSVPs, all very streamlined and eco-friendly. For the rest of the brunch, Margaret felt like she was watching her son's wedding being planned from the outside. Every suggestion she made was politely deflected. Every offer to help was kindly but firmly refused. By the time they said goodbye in the restaurant parking lot, Margaret felt more like a distant relative than the mother of the groom. I'll send you all the details soon, Mom, David promised as he hugged her goodbye. The date, the location, what to wear, everything you need to know. But the details never came. April passed with Margaret checking her email obsessively, waiting for the invitation or at least some information about her son's wedding. When she called David to ask about it, he was always rushing to another meeting or heading out with Vanessa, promising to get back to her soon with all the information. May arrived with still no concrete details, just vague assurances that everything was on track and she would definitely get the information in time. By early June, Margaret's anxiety had transformed into genuine panic. She called David's office directly, only to be told he was out of town on business. She tried his cell phone repeatedly, getting voicemail each time. Finally, desperate for some concrete information, she drove to his apartment, only to discover that he had moved. The new tenant told her he'd been gone for over a month. Margaret sat in her car outside David's old apartment building, hands shaking as she tried to process what was happening. Her son was getting married in less than 2 weeks, and she didn't know where he lived, where the wedding was taking place, or apparently where he was at all. That evening, she finally got through to him on his cell phone. Mom, sorry I've been so hard to reach. Things have been absolutely insane with the wedding planning and this new project at work. His voice sounded strained, hurried. David, where are you living? I went by your apartment and, oh right, I meant to tell you. Vanessa and I decided to move in together before the wedding. We found this amazing place in Cherry Creek, much closer to her office. Cherry Creek, the most expensive neighborhood in Denver. Margaret felt a chill of apprehension. That sounds lovely. Could you give me the address? And I still need the wedding details, honey. The date, the time, the location, what I should wear. Of course, of course. Vanessa has all that information organized. I'll have her send you everything this week, promise. But once again, nothing came. On Friday, June 14th, the day before the wedding, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She called every church in the Denver metro area, asking if they had a Chen Morrison wedding scheduled for Saturday. On her 15th call, she found it. St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church in the upscale Highlands neighborhood. The wedding was scheduled for 2 p.m. Margaret spent that evening in a state of nervous excitement, pressing her best dress, polishing her shoes, and trying to convince herself that there had simply been some miscommunication. David would be surprised to see her, of course, but pleasantly surprised. They would laugh about the mix-up later, and she would finally get to witness her son's wedding, even if she hadn't been properly included in the planning. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for a wedding. Margaret arrived at St. Bartholomew's at 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes early, as was her habit. She parked in the lot and walked toward the beautiful stone church, her heart full of anticipation despite the months of confusion and distance. The church was quiet, too quiet. Margaret pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the empty sanctuary. Rows of pews sat vacant. No flowers decorated the altar, no wedding programs waited on the tables by the entrance. A few rays of colored light filtered through the stained glass windows, illuminating nothing but dust motes dancing in the air. "Excuse me," came a voice from behind her. Margaret turned to see an elderly man in clerical collar approaching with a kind but confused expression. "Are you looking for someone?" "The church is empty today. I'm here for the Chen Morrison wedding," Margaret stammered. "It's supposed to be at 2 p.m. The priest, Father Mackenzie, according to his name tag, looked genuinely puzzled. "Chen Morrison? I'm sorry, but there's no wedding scheduled here today." "Are you sure you have the right church?" Margaret's world seemed to tilt on its axis. "But I called yesterday. Your secretary confirmed there was a Chen Morrison wedding today at 2 p.m. Father Mackenzie's expression softened with understanding and something that looked like sympathy. "Mrs. Morrison, I think there may have been some confusion. We did have a Chen Morrison wedding scheduled, but it took place yesterday afternoon. Friday, June 13th. Beautiful ceremony, actually. Intimate gathering, maybe 30 people." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Yesterday. The wedding had been yesterday. David had gotten married, and she hadn't been there. She hadn't been invited. She hadn't even known. Are you family?" Father Mackenzie asked gently, clearly recognizing her distress. "I'm David's mother," Margaret whispered, the words feeling strange and hollow in the empty church. The priest's face filled with compassion and confusion. "Oh my, I'm so sorry, There must have been some terrible misunderstanding. Are you sure about the date?" "Perhaps." But Margaret was already backing away, mumbling apologies, fleeing toward the door. She made it to her car before the tears came, great wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being. 28 years of love, sacrifice, and devotion, and she had been deliberately excluded from the most important day of her son's life. As she sat in the church parking lot, crying until she had no tears left, Margaret realized that this wasn't just about missing a wedding. This was about the systematic erasure of her relationship with her son, orchestrated so skillfully and gradually that she had barely noticed it happening until it was too late. Or perhaps, she thought with a spark of something that felt like anger beginning to kindle beneath the grief, perhaps it wasn't too late at all. Margaret drove home in a daze, her mind reeling between disbelief and a growing sense of betrayal. The familiar streets of her neighborhood seemed foreign, as if she were seeing them through new eyes, the eyes of someone whose entire understanding of her most important relationship had been shattered in the span of a single conversation with a sympathetic priest. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the house that had been the center of her world with David, the garden she had tended so carefully, hoping Vanessa might appreciate fresh flowers for the wedding, the kitchen window where she had watched for David's car every Tuesday evening, the front porch where they had sat together on summer evenings, planning his future. Inside, the silence felt oppressive. Margaret moved through the rooms mechanically, putting away the wedding outfit she would never wear, removing the congratulatory card she had planned to give them, hiding the gift she had spent weeks selecting, a handcrafted jewelry box for Vanessa that had cost her nearly a month's worth of grocery money. It wasn't until she was putting the gift away in her closet that the full reality hit her. She sank onto her bed, holding the jewelry box, and began to sob again. Not just the tears of missing an event, but the deeper grief of recognizing that her son, her beloved, devoted son, had become someone capable of this level of cruelty. Or had he? The thought struck her like lightning. In all the months of watching David change, she had assumed he was making these choices willingly, growing into someone new under Vanessa's influence. But what if it wasn't willing? What if it wasn't even David's choice at all? Margaret had worked in the emergency room long enough to recognize the signs of abuse, not just physical abuse, but the more subtle forms of manipulation and control that left no visible bruises but devastated lives just as completely. She had seen women who gradually lost contact with their families, who changed their appearance and behavior to please controlling partners, who became shadows of their former selves while insisting they had never been happier. Could the same thing be happening to David? The more Margaret thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together. The gradual isolation from family traditions, the change in his appearance and vocabulary, the way he had seemed strained and hurried during their recent conversations, as if he were always looking over his shoulder. The fact that he had moved without telling her, that his calls had become infrequent and brief, that all communication about the wedding had supposedly been handled by Vanessa. Margaret had assumed she was being excluded by David. But what if David was being manipulated into excluding her? Sunday morning found Margaret at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a yellow legal pad, trying to organize her thoughts and plan her next steps. She had barely slept, her mind churning through memories of the past 2 years, re-examining every interaction through this new lens of suspicion. The first thing she needed was more information. If Vanessa was indeed manipulating David, then Margaret needed to understand who she was really dealing with. She opened her laptop, a Christmas gift from David 3 years ago, and began to search. Vanessa Morrison's social media presence was immaculate and extensive. Her Instagram account showcased a life of enviable sophistication: art gallery openings, wine tastings, weekend trips to Aspen, perfectly plated meals at restaurants Margaret couldn't afford. Her LinkedIn profile listed impressive credentials and a series of successful marketing positions at increasingly prestigious firms. But as Margaret dug deeper, something began to feel off. The posts were too perfect, too polished, almost like a carefully constructed advertisement for a lifestyle rather than genuine glimpses into someone's life. There were very few photos with other people, and when friends did appear, they seemed to change frequently. No long-term relationships, no consistent friend group, no deep connections visible anywhere. Most telling, there were almost no photos of David until very recently, and when he did appear, he looked uncomfortable, forced, like he was playing a role rather than genuinely enjoying himself. Margaret scrolled back through 2 years of posts, looking for any glimpse of the real person behind the curated perfection. What she found instead was a pattern that made her blood run cold. Every 6 to 8 months, there would be photos of Vanessa with a different man, always successful-looking, always well-dressed, always gazing at her with the same adoring expression that Margaret had seen on David's face. There was James, a lawyer from what appeared to be early last year. Before him, Michael, not Margaret's late husband, but a different Michael, who seemed to be a doctor based on the hospital fundraiser photos. Before Michael, someone named Robert, who appeared to work in finance. Each relationship seemed to follow the same pattern: intense romance, social media documentation of an enviable lifestyle, then sudden disappearance from her feed. Margaret felt sick. She was looking at what appeared to be a predatory pattern, and her son was just the latest victim. But she needed more than social media speculation. She needed concrete evidence, real information about who Vanessa Morrison really was and what she was capable of. Monday morning, Margaret called in sick to work for the first time in over 2 years. Instead of going to the hospital, she drove to the Denver Public Library and spent the day learning how to conduct thorough internet research. She searched public records, professional licensing databases, and news archives. She learned about reverse image searches and cached web pages. She discovered tools for finding hidden social media accounts and deleted posts. What she found painted a disturbing picture. Vanessa's employment history, when cross-referenced with actual company records, didn't quite match her LinkedIn claims. Several of the firms listed as her employers had no record of her working there, or showed employment periods that were much shorter than her profile indicated. Her college degree, supposedly from Northwestern University, couldn't be verified through the alumni directory. More disturbing were the traces Margaret found of legal troubles. A small item in a Chicago newspaper from 3 years ago mentioned a Vanessa Morrison in connection with a harassment case filed by a former boyfriend. Another brief mention in an Austin business journal referenced a Morrison who had been terminated from a marketing firm for violations of professional conduct. The details were vague, but the pattern was becoming clearer. Margaret realized she was dealing with someone who had built an entire false identity and had a history of destructive relationships with the kind of successful, caring men who would be attractive targets for financial and emotional exploitation. But understanding the threat wasn't the same as being able to protect David from it. Margaret needed proof, evidence so compelling that even someone under Vanessa's influence couldn't ignore it. And she needed to find a way to reach her son without Vanessa intercepting her attempts. That evening, Margaret tried calling David's cell phone, only to discover that the number had been changed. She tried his work number and was told he was unavailable and would return her call. He never did. She sent emails to his personal account and received automated responses saying he was out of the office with limited access to email. every avenue of communication had been severed. Vanessa had succeeded in completely isolating David from his mother. But Margaret wasn't ready to give up. She began calling David's friends, people she had known since he was in college. What she learned was even more disturbing than she had feared. "Mrs. Chen, I'm so glad you called," said Tom Bradley, David's roommate from Colorado State, who had remained a close friend for years. "I've been worried about David for months. He stopped returning my calls around Christmas. When I ran into him at the grocery store in March, he barely acknowledged me. It was like he was a different person." Sarah Martinez, another longtime friend, had a similar story. "He missed my birthday party in February, which was so unlike him. When I called to check if he was okay, this woman answered his phone, Vanessa, I think, and told me he was too busy to talk. I never heard from him again." One by one, Margaret discovered that David had been systematically cut off from every meaningful relationship in his life. Friends who had known him for years described the same pattern: gradual withdrawal, missed events, canceled plans, and eventually, complete silence. "I thought maybe he was just really focused on his relationship," admitted Jake Morrison, no relation to Vanessa, David's best friend since high school. "You know how guys can get when they're serious about someone. But now that I think about it, it was more than that. The few times I saw him after he started dating her, he seemed anxious, like he was constantly worried about saying or doing the wrong thing." Margaret felt her anger building as the full scope of Vanessa's manipulation became clear. This wasn't just about excluding her from a wedding. This was about the complete psychological domination of her son. Armed with the knowledge that she wasn't alone in her concerns, Margaret began reaching out to David's former girlfriends. It was an awkward process. She had maintained friendly relationships with a few of them, but calling to ask about their experiences felt intrusive and strange. However, the information she gathered was invaluable. "Mrs. Chen, I'm surprised to hear from you, but I'm glad you called," said Jennifer Walsh, a teacher David had dated seriously for 8 months about 3 years earlier. "I heard through mutual friends that David was engaged, and I have to admit I was worried. Not because I wanted him back, but because of some things I heard about his fiancée." Jennifer had worked at a school in Cherry Creek, the upscale district where Vanessa now lived. Through the teacher network, she had heard disturbing stories about a woman matching Vanessa's description who had been involved with several prominent men in the area. "There was this pattern," Jennifer explained. "She would target successful, kind-hearted men who were a little isolated or vulnerable, men who had lost parents recently, or were going through career transitions, or just didn't have strong social networks. She was like a heat-seeking missile for loneliness." The most chilling information came from Dr. Patricia Brennan, a psychiatrist Jennifer knew who had treated 2 men who had been involved with Vanessa in previous years. "I can't give you details because of patient confidentiality," Dr. Brennan explained when Margaret called her. "But I can tell you that the woman you're describing sounds like someone who exhibits classic patterns of what we call coercive control. It's a form of psychological abuse that's often misunderstood because it doesn't leave physical marks." Dr. Brennan explained how coercive control worked: the gradual isolation from support systems, the constant criticism disguised as helpfulness, the creation of financial dependence, the subtle threats and punishments that trained victims to modify their behavior to avoid conflict. "The victim often doesn't realize what's happening because the changes occur so slowly," Dr. Brennan continued. "They think they're making choices, but really, their entire decision-making process has been compromised. The abuser becomes the lens through which they see everything else, including their own family and friends." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. This was exactly what she had witnessed happening to David. "Is there anything I can do?" Margaret asked desperately. "Any way to help him see what's happening?" "The most important thing is to maintain some form of contact, even if it's minimal," Dr. Brennan advised. Abusers work to convince their victims that no one else cares about them, that they've been abandoned by everyone except the abuser. If you can find any way to let him know you still love him and are still there for him, it plants seeds that might eventually help him break free. But that was exactly the problem. Margaret had no way to reach David. Every communication channel had been blocked or monitored. Frustrated but not defeated, Margaret decided to expand her investigation. If she couldn't reach David directly, perhaps she could build a case so compelling that it would eventually find its way to him through other channels. She started with Vanessa's professional network. Using the techniques she had learned at the library, Margaret began contacting people who had worked with Vanessa at her various jobs. What she discovered was a pattern of short-term employment, personality conflicts, and allegations of unethical behavior. She was incredibly charming during the interview process, explained Margaret Chen, no relation, a former supervisor at a Denver marketing firm where Vanessa had worked for less than 6 months. But once she was hired, problems started almost immediately. She seemed to thrive on creating drama between team members. She would share confidential information to create conflicts, then position herself as the person who could resolve them. Marcus described how Vanessa had systematically undermined other employees, spreading rumors and creating situations that made her colleagues look incompetent or unreliable. When she was finally terminated, it was because clients had started complaining about her unprofessional conduct. The strangest thing was how she seemed to target one person at a time for special attention. Usually someone with influence or resources that could benefit her, Marcus continued. She had this way of making people feel like they were the most important person in the world, at least until she got what she needed from them. Similar stories emerged from other former employers, a pattern of manipulation, exploitation, and destruction that left emotional and professional wreckage in its wake. Margaret also began investigating Vanessa's previous relationships more thoroughly. Through social media connections and mutual acquaintances, she was able to identify and contact 3 of Vanessa's former boyfriends. The stories she heard were heartbreakingly similar to what she feared was happening to David. Robert Martinez, the finance professional Margaret had seen in Vanessa's old Instagram photos, agreed to meet her for coffee after she explained her concerns about David. "I should have seen it coming," Robert said, stirring sugar into his espresso with shaking hands. "But she was so good at what she did. She made me feel like I was the most successful, most interesting man she'd ever met. After my divorce, I was vulnerable, and she seemed to understand exactly what I needed to hear." Robert described how Vanessa had gradually taken over his social life, suggesting that his friends were holding him back and that he deserved a higher caliber of people. She had convinced him to lend her money for various emergencies and investment opportunities. She had moved into his apartment and slowly replaced his belongings with her own preferences. "The worst part was how she made me doubt myself," Robert continued. "Any time I questioned her or tried to maintain some independence, she would make me feel like I was being paranoid or controlling. She had this way of twisting every conversation so that I ended up apologizing for things I hadn't even done wrong." The relationship had ended when Robert discovered that Vanessa had been stealing money from his accounts and had opened credit cards in his name. When he confronted her, she had tried to convince him that he was having memory problems and had authorized all the transactions himself. "I almost believed her," Robert admitted. "She was so convincing, so confident. If my sister hadn't come to visit and confirmed that I was remembering things correctly, I might have ended up in a psychiatric facility instead of ending the relationship." Dr. Michael Torres, the physician Margaret had identified from older social media posts, told a similar story. Vanessa had isolated him from his medical practice colleagues, convinced him to make risky financial investments that benefited her, and had nearly destroyed his career before he finally recognized what was happening. "The scary thing is how good she is at reading people," Dr. Torres explained. "She knew exactly what my insecurities were, exactly what my dreams and fears were, and she used all of that against me. She made me believe that she was the only person who truly understood me, while systematically destroying every other relationship in my life." Both men described the same pattern: gradual isolation, financial exploitation, psychological manipulation, and attempts to make the victim doubt their own perceptions and memories. Both had eventually escaped, but only after significant damage to their finances, careers, and mental health. Most importantly, both men confirmed what Margaret had begun to suspect: that Vanessa was not just a manipulative person, but someone who had refined her techniques through multiple relationships and was operating with the skill and calculation of a professional con artist. By the end of June, Margaret had compiled a thick folder of evidence documenting Vanessa's pattern of predatory behavior. She had documentation of false employment claims and professional misconduct, testimony from 3 former boyfriends describing identical patterns of manipulation and abuse, evidence of financial fraud in previous relationships, professional opinions from Dr. Brennan about the psychological techniques being used, a timeline showing how David's isolation had followed the exact same pattern as previous victims, but having evidence and being able to use it were 2 different things. Margaret still had no way to reach David directly, and she knew that simply showing up at his new address would likely backfire, giving Vanessa more ammunition to paint her as a crazy, obsessive mother. She needed a strategy that would bypass Vanessa's control and reach David in a way that he couldn't dismiss or ignore. The answer came from an unexpected source, Jake Morrison, David's best friend from high school, who called Margaret in early July with urgent news. "Mrs. Chen, I think something's really wrong," Jake said, his voice tight with worry. "I've been trying to respect David's space, you know? I figured if he wanted to cut me out of his life, that was his choice. But I just found out he didn't show up for work last week. His boss called me because I'm listed as his emergency contact." Margaret felt her heart stop. "What do you mean he didn't show up?" According to his supervisor, David called in sick on Monday, then just disappeared. He hasn't answered calls, hasn't responded to emails, hasn't shown up to the office. His boss is considering it job abandonment and is going to start termination procedures if he doesn't hear from David by the end of the week. This was completely unlike David, who had never missed work without proper notice in his entire career. Margaret realized that the situation was far more serious than she had imagined. Vanessa's control had apparently reached the point where David was no longer able to maintain even basic responsibilities. "Jake, I think David is in serious trouble," Margaret said, making a decision that would change everything. "I think his wife is abusing him, and I think we need to intervene before it's too late." "What do you need me to do?" Jake asked without hesitation. Margaret looked at the folder of evidence she had compiled, took a deep breath, and began to plan a rescue mission for her son. Margaret's plan was both simple and terrifying. She would confront Vanessa directly, armed with irrefutable evidence of her predatory pattern, and demand access to David. But she wouldn't go alone. Jake had agreed to accompany her, and Dr. Brennan had provided her with a letter outlining the psychological abuse patterns and recommending immediate intervention. Most importantly, Robert Martinez, Vanessa's former victim, had agreed to come with them. His presence would serve as living proof of Vanessa's methods and give David a chance to hear from someone who had escaped a similar situation. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked as they sat in Margaret's car outside the luxury apartment complex in Cherry Creek where David now lived. "What if she calls the police?" "Then we'll show them the evidence," Margaret replied, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "What if we don't try and something terrible happens to David? I can live with Vanessa calling me crazy. I can't live with not trying to save my son." Robert, sitting in the back seat, nodded grimly. "She's going to try to make you doubt yourselves. That's what she does. She's incredibly good at turning every confrontation around so that you end up feeling like the problem. Just remember that everything you've discovered about her is real, no matter how convincing she sounds." They had timed their visit for early Saturday morning, hoping to catch David when he might be more alert and less supervised. Margaret had also brought copies of all her evidence, in case they needed to leave documentation behind. The apartment building was intimidatingly upscale. Marble lobby, concierge desk, the kind of place that screamed expensive. Margaret wondered how David was affording this lifestyle on his software engineer salary, though she suspected she already knew the answer. They took the elevator to the 15th floor, and Margaret's hand shook as she pressed the doorbell for apartment 1507. The seconds stretched endlessly before the door opened. Vanessa stood in the doorway, looking as perfectly polished as ever, despite the early hour. She was wearing silk pajamas that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly utility bill, her blonde hair styled in effortless waves, her makeup subtle but flawless. When she saw Margaret, her expression shifted from mild curiosity to cold calculation. "Margaret," she said, not bothering to hide her displeasure. "What an unexpected surprise. David's sleeping." I need to see my son, Margaret said, fighting to keep her voice steady. It's important. I'm afraid that's not possible right now, Vanessa replied smoothly. David's been under tremendous stress lately, and his doctor has recommended complete rest. Perhaps you could call later in the week. The lie was so smoothly delivered that Margaret almost doubted her own knowledge of David's work absence. This was exactly what Robert had warned her about, Vanessa's ability to create an alternate reality through sheer confidence. Actually, I think David would want to see us, Jake interjected, stepping forward, especially since we know about his job situation. Something flickered in Vanessa's eyes, surprise, anger, or perhaps fear. I'm sorry, who are you? I'm Jake Morrison, David's best friend since high school. And this is Robert Martinez. I think you two know each other. When Vanessa's gaze fell on Robert, her perfectly composed mask slipped for just a moment. Margaret saw genuine shock, followed quickly by rage, before the polished smile returned. Robert, what a delightful surprise! I had no idea you were in Denver. How wonderful to see you again. Her voice was honey-sweet, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the doorframe. Hello, Vanessa, Robert replied calmly. I think we need to talk, all of us, including David. I'm afraid David really isn't feeling well, Vanessa insisted, but her voice had taken on a slightly shrill quality. Perhaps we could arrange something for another time. Vanessa? A voice came from inside the apartment, weak, confused, but unmistakably David's. Who's at the door? Margaret's heart clenched at the sound of her son's voice. He sounded exhausted, disoriented, almost fragile in a way that was completely foreign to the confident, capable man she had raised. It's no one important, darling, Vanessa called back, never taking her eyes off Margaret. Go back to sleep. But footsteps approached from inside the apartment, and suddenly David appeared behind Vanessa, looking like a shadow of his former self. He had lost weight, his usually neat hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of either sleepless nights or something worse. When he saw Margaret, his face cycled through confusion, recognition, and something that looked like fear. Mom? He whispered, and Margaret heard years of pain and longing in that single word. Hello, sweetheart, Margaret said softly, tears threatening to overwhelm her. I've missed you so much. David looked between Margaret and Vanessa, and Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. Part of him wanted to run to her, she could tell, but something was holding him back. David, you should go lie down, Vanessa said firmly, placing a proprietary hand on his arm. You know how agitated you get when you're overtired. The word agitated sent a chill down Margaret's spine. It was the kind of language used to pathologize normal emotional responses, to make someone doubt their own reactions. Actually, David, we came because we're worried about you, Jake said, ignoring Vanessa completely and speaking directly to his friend. Your boss called me. You haven't been to work all week. David's face crumpled with confusion. Work? But Vanessa said I called in sick. She said she talked to my supervisor and explained that I needed extended leave for medical reasons. That's not what happened, buddy, Jake said gently. Your boss has been trying to reach you directly. He's concerned about you. Margaret watched as David processed this information, saw the moment when doubt began to crack through whatever spell he had been under. This was her chance. David, we need to talk, she said. All of us together. There are some things you need to know. What followed was the most difficult conversation of Margaret's life, but also the most important. They moved into the apartment's living room, a space that Margaret recognized as having been completely transformed from David's taste to something more in line with Vanessa's aesthetic preferences. Nothing remained of the warm, comfortable style David had always favored. Margaret began by showing David the evidence she had compiled, the employment discrepancies in Vanessa's background, the testimonies from former employers about her professional misconduct, the pattern of short-term relationships with successful, isolated men. This is ridiculous, Vanessa interjected repeatedly. David, you know how jealous and controlling your mother has always been. This is exactly what we talked about, her inability to let you have an adult relationship. But Margaret was prepared for this tactic too. She had Dr. Brennan's letter explaining how abusers use exactly this kind of deflection, turning their victims against anyone who tries to help them. "David," Robert said quietly, "does any of this sound familiar? Has Vanessa ever told you that you're remembering things wrong? That you're being paranoid or overly sensitive? That everyone who cares about you is actually trying to hold you back?" David's face went very pale. How do you know about that?" "Because she did the same thing to me," Robert replied. "And to Michael Torres, the doctor. And probably to James and the others before us. It's a pattern, David. A very deliberate, calculated pattern." Margaret watched as her son began to truly listen, perhaps for the first time in months. She pulled out her phone and showed him the saved screenshots of Vanessa's social media history, all the previous boyfriends, the timeline of relationships that followed identical patterns. "I don't understand," David whispered, staring at the images. "She told me she'd only had a few serious relationships. She said most men couldn't handle how successful and independent she was." "David, darling, they're obviously doctoring these images," Vanessa said. But her voice had lost some of its confident authority. "You know how easy it is to manipulate social media posts." But David was looking at her now with new eyes, and Margaret could see the recognition dawning. "The photos are time-stamped, Vanessa, and they match the employment timeline that doesn't add up. And," he paused, his voice growing stronger, "they explain why you always knew exactly what to say to me, exactly what I needed to hear. You'd done this before." Jake pulled out his own phone and showed David the screenshots he'd taken of their text conversation history. "Look at this, man. We used to text constantly. Then look at February. See how your messages started getting shorter and less frequent? And then here in April, they just stop completely. But the last message you sent me said you were reassessing your priorities and focusing on people who really matter. Does that sound like something you would say?" David stared at the phone, his hands shaking. I don't remember sending that message." "Because you probably didn't," Margaret said gently. "David, when was the last time you had your phone completely to yourself? When was the last time you checked your own messages or made your own calls without Vanessa being involved somehow?" The silence that followed was answer enough. David looked around the apartment as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the absence of anything that reflected his own personality, his own history, his own choices. "Where are my books?" he asked suddenly. "I had boxes of books. And my photographs, the ones of Dad and us and my friends from college. Where did they all go?" "You said you wanted to simplify your life," Vanessa replied quickly. "You said those things were holding you back from becoming the person you wanted to be. Don't you remember? We donated them to charity together." But David was shaking his head, tears starting to flow. No, I would never have donated Dad's photographs. I would never have gotten rid of his books. Those were all I had left of him." Margaret felt her heart breaking for her son, but also a fierce pride in his strength. Despite months of psychological manipulation, his core self was fighting back. "David," she said softly, "do you remember our conversation about the wedding? When you told me you'd send me all the details?" David looked genuinely puzzled. "What conversation?" "Mom, I called you after the wedding to explain. Vanessa said you were hurt that we kept it small, but that you understood. She said you wished us well and that you'd talk to us when you were feeling better." The lie was so brazen, so completely fabricated, that even Vanessa seemed to realize she had overplayed her hand. Margaret saw her calculating, trying to figure out how to recover from this obvious falsehood. "I never received a call from you after the wedding, David," Margaret said gently. "I found out about it by accident when I went to the wrong church on the wrong day. That's how I discovered you had gotten married." The devastation on David's face was terrible to witness. But Vanessa showed me the call log. She showed me that you hung up on me when I tried to explain." "David, check your phone," Jake suggested. "Look at your actual call history." With trembling hands, David pulled out his phone and scrolled through his recent calls. Margaret watched as confusion gave way to horror as he realized there was no record of any call to his mother after the wedding. "There's nothing here," he whispered. "I didn't call you. But I remember the conversation. I remember you hanging up on me." "False memories," Robert said quietly. "She's very good at implanting them. She did the same thing to me, convinced me I had authorized financial transactions that I never made, had conversations that never happened. She's probably been telling you detailed stories about things that never occurred until you started believing they were your own memories. What happened next was like watching someone wake up from a terrible dream. David began questioning everything, every memory, every decision, every belief about his recent life that didn't feel quite right. And with each question, more of Vanessa's carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. He discovered that she had been intercepting his mail and emails, filtering his communications so that he only received what she wanted him to see. She had been managing his social media accounts, posting updates that made it seem like he was happy and active while systematically blocking or unfriending people from his past. She had even been dosing his morning coffee with mild sedatives, just herbal supplements to help with your anxiety, darling, to keep him compliant and foggy. The financial abuse was extensive too. Vanessa had convinced David to give her access to his accounts to help manage their shared expenses, then had been systematically draining his savings for her own use. The expensive apartment, the designer clothes, the lavish lifestyle, it was all being funded by David's money, while she contributed nothing. Most insidiously, she had been working to isolate him from every source of external validation and support. His friends had been systematically eliminated through manufactured conflicts or simply blocked communications. His work relationships had been undermined through her advice about office politics that was actually designed to make him appear unreliable or difficult. Even his relationship with Margaret had been destroyed through a careful campaign of lies and manipulation. The goal was to make you completely dependent on me, Vanessa finally admitted when the evidence became overwhelming and denial was no longer possible. Her mask had completely fallen away now, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Emotionally, financially, socially, I wanted you to have no choice but to stay with me. But why? David asked, his voice broken. If you never loved me, if this was all just manipulation, why me? Why any of us? Vanessa's laugh was bitter and empty. Love is for people who can't get what they need any other way. I prefer more direct methods. You were perfect, David, successful, lonely after your father died, grateful for attention, eager to please. The kind of man who would give me everything I wanted while thinking it was his idea. Margaret had to restrain herself from physically attacking this woman who had nearly destroyed her son. But David needed to hear this, needed to understand the full scope of what had been done to him. The wedding, David said slowly. You planned it for the day before you told my mother, didn't you? You wanted to make sure she couldn't be there. Of course, Vanessa replied with casual cruelty. She was the biggest threat to my control over you. As long as she was in your life, you had someone who might make you question what I was doing. Eliminating her was essential. The silence that followed was profound. Margaret watched as her son absorbed the full reality of how thoroughly he had been betrayed, how completely his life had been manipulated and controlled. Then something shifted in David's expression. The confusion and pain gave way to anger, clean, righteous anger that burned away the last of Vanessa's influence over him. Get out, he said quietly. David, darling, you're upset? Get out! He roared, with more force and clarity than Margaret had heard from him in 2 years. Get out of my home, get away from my family, and don't ever contact me again. Vanessa looked around the room, perhaps calculating whether she could salvage the situation or reconvince David that everyone else was lying. But she must have seen something in his face that told her the game was over. Fine, she said, her voice turning venomous. You'll regret this, David. You'll realize that I was the best thing that ever happened to you, and by then, it will be too late. You'll come crawling back, just like they all do. But David was already turning away from her, walking toward his mother with tears streaming down his face. Margaret met her son in the middle of the room, wrapping him in the kind of hug she had been dreaming of for 2 years. He collapsed against her, sobbing like the child he had once been, and she held him while Jake and Robert made sure Vanessa actually left the apartment. I'm so sorry, Mom, David whispered through his tears. I'm so sorry I believed her. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I'm so sorry I let her take me away from you. Shh, Margaret murmured, stroking his hair just as she had when he was small and frightened. You have nothing to apologize for. You were being abused, sweetheart. None of this was your fault. The weeks that followed were difficult but hopeful. David moved out of the Cherry Creek apartment and back into his childhood home while he recovered from the psychological trauma of the relationship. Margaret took extended leave from work to help him through the worst of it, and together they slowly began rebuilding their relationship. David's employer was understanding when they explained the situation, especially after Margaret provided documentation from Dr. Brennan about coercive control and its effects on victims. He was able to return to work with the support of his colleagues, many of whom admitted they had noticed changes in his behavior, but hadn't known how to help. The legal system was less helpful. While David was able to recover some of his stolen money through bank fraud claims, Vanessa had covered her tracks too well for criminal charges to stick. She simply disappeared from Denver, presumably to find her next victim in another city. But Margaret and David decided to take proactive steps to prevent her from hurting others. They worked with Robert and Dr. Torres to compile a comprehensive report documenting her methods and pattern of abuse. They shared this information with law enforcement agencies and domestic violence organizations, hoping it might help future victims or investigators recognize the signs earlier. More importantly, they began speaking publicly about their experience. David joined a support group for survivors of psychological abuse, where he learned that his experience was far from unique and that recovery was possible. Margaret became an advocate for family members trying to help loved ones in similar situations, sharing the techniques she had learned for building evidence and maintaining contact even when communication was blocked. Their relationship, when it was finally restored, was deeper and more honest than it had ever been before. The experience had taught them both about the fragility of trust and the importance of maintaining connections even when circumstances make it difficult. They established new traditions and boundaries that honored both David's independence as an adult and Margaret's role as a loving mother. 6 months after Vanessa's departure, David met someone new, a colleague from work named Lisa who appreciated his kindness, respected his relationship with his mother, and encouraged him to reconnect with the friends he had lost. Their relationship developed slowly, with plenty of input from David's support system, and Margaret was delighted to be included from the very beginning. At their engagement party the following year, David gave a speech that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. I learned the hard way that love isn't about control or manipulation or making someone dependent on you, he said, holding Lisa's hand and looking directly at his mother. Real love is about supporting each other's growth, celebrating each other's connections, and building something together that makes both people stronger. I'm grateful every day for the people who refused to give up on me when I couldn't see what was happening to me. And I'm especially grateful to my mom, who loved me enough to fight for me even when I didn't know I needed fighting for. 2 years later, Margaret sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she had once waited every Tuesday for David's visits. The same kitchen where she had cried over unanswered phone calls and missed connections. But now it was filled with the sounds of family again. David and Lisa's voices in the living room, the laughter of Jake and his wife who had joined them for Sunday dinner, the comfortable chatter of people who genuinely cared about each other. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them to this point, from the devastating discovery at the church to the patient work of investigation and intervention. She thought about how close she had come to losing David forever, and how easily she might have given up if she'd accepted the narrative that he simply didn't want her in his life anymore. The experience had taught her that love sometimes requires fierce action, not just patient waiting. It had shown her that manipulation and abuse could happen to anyone, even smart, capable adults like her son, and that recognizing the signs was the first step in fighting back. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that family bonds, even when they seem completely severed, can be stronger than the forces that try to destroy them. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from David. Thanks for dinner, Mom. Lisa and I will see you next Sunday. Love you. She smiled and typed back. Love you too, sweetheart. See you next week. Some bonds, Margaret reflected as she watched her son and his fiancée through the kitchen window, are worth fighting for no matter what. And sometimes, the fight to preserve them reveals their true strength. The wedding invitation arrived 3 months later. Simple, elegant, and addressed to Mrs. Margaret Chen, Mother of the groom, with love and gratitude. Margaret cried when she opened it, but these were tears of joy for a battle won and a family restored. This time, she would be there to witness her son's wedding. This time, she would be exactly where she belonged,